So the Aston Martin Vantage of the early 2000s was actually created to compete directly with the Porsche 911. And I had two 911s in the past, which is why the car intrigued me. I was looking at replacing my 996 with 120,000 miles. I drove it out all the way up to 120,000 miles, and it was time to replace it. And I thought, you know, there's a lot of, I would spend a lot of money for essentially another evolution of the same car I had before. This car came along, and I thought, well, I love Aston Martin as a brand, and it's really exciting, the prospect of owning one, and they're actually quite a bargain at the time. So this car was designed by Heinrich Fisker, but Ian Callum had a huge input on the design as well. In fact, Ian Callum, I think, said in an interview with Car and Driver that he was about 80% responsible for the car. So I'm not going to argue with him because he was there. But when I look at this car, I think this is more of a Fisker style car. If you look at this car compared to the Fisker Karma, which is an attractive car, but it was a terrible car, and the BMW Z8, those were Fisker designs, and I think I see more family resemblance between this and the Ian Callum designs, which are the DB9 and even my XK in there, which is a strong Ian Callum design. But that's just the way my eye sees it. So let me know what you think. Let's take a look a little bit closer at the design. So the Aston Martin V8 Vantage was a new kind of car for Aston Martin. It was a platform technology car. It was built in Gaydon alongside the DB9 and was all aluminum. It was bonded aluminum in a pretty cool process that really was hand-built. A lot of people argue, well, was the car really hand-built? Well, it wasn't hand-built like cars were in the old days of Aston Martin, where they were literally pounded out with a hammer by some old guy. The car's body panels were generally pressed steel, but they were assembled by hand. And it still gives it a really, really cool cachet, while at the same time being a little bit less put together by hand than the old cars were. And I mean that in a good way. So you have a lot of the reliability of sort of modern day automotive technology without the sort of downsides that you had. But in terms of the car, the early cars came out in 2005. I've seen very few 2005 cars in my day. I've seen a handful of 2006s, and all those cars tended to be very stripped out. They didn't have the navigation system, which was no great loss. It's terrible. They didn't have cruise control, believe it or not, a $100,000 car without cruise control, and didn't have Bluetooth, which is kind of a given nowadays. And the Bluetooth, unlike in my Jaguar, in this car actually works, and it works pretty well. So this car's a 2007, and it has red brake calipers, which I believe weren't available in 2005, 2006, but you could correct me on that one if you guys know better. as time went on, they sort of introduced more and more extra features. But unlike Porsche, which this car competed against, it was not an a la carte sort of a pricing, which I personally find a little bit annoying, because in Porsche you have a base model, and then each feature is so expensive, and there's so many of them that it's like, what does a 911 cost? I don't know. No one knows what a 911 costs, because there are so many features. It could be $200,000, it could be $100,000 nowadays. So this car wasn't really priced out that way. Although with the new Aston Martin Vantage, the current one, they have actually kind of gone to that sort of pricing, because let's face it, it's very, very profitable for car companies. Out the trunk space, is there room in the trunk to put things? Well, I got my usual luggage out here, which I bought a long time ago when I was in college, thinking that I was going to do more traveling for business. And this is what I like to use as my benchmark. So let's see, got the garment bag in here, the rolly thing here, and I think that'll close. There you go. So you can actually fit enough luggage in here. Let me take this. You can actually fit enough luggage in here for a weekend if you wanted to. Let's take a look underneath the bonnet of this car. Immediately you feel how light the hood is, because it's aluminum again. And look at that engine. I will say that in the early 2000s, Aston Martin had probably the best looking engine bays of any manufacturer, save for maybe Ferrari. But this is just such a tidy engine bay, and everything is functional. I see very little plastic in here, no plastic covers. I see this is a piece of metal over here. You have the wonderful Aston Martin badge. This is the 4.3 V8. Later models were the 4.7, and then they slowly increased horsepower until they went to the N420 model. Yeah, so it's actually pretty easy to work on. Now this engine is actually based on the AJ V8, but it's only loosely based on the AJ V8. The intake is totally different, the crankshaft is different, the pistons are different. The most important difference, I would say, probably the biggest difference between this and the AJ V8 is the fact that it has dry sump. This is a dry sump system. So in fact, here's your separate oil tank there. Now what you get with the dry sump system is you have oil that is constantly flowing through the engine. It's not being picked up by a pan in the bottom. And what does that do for you? Well, in hard cornering, it means that you always get the same amount of oil flow. You won't starve the engine of oil. So it's definitely something that can be safely taken to the track. That's a very important thing, particularly in my case. The other thing that you get with a dry sump system is that you can, because there's no pan underneath, you can actually lower the engine by a few inches. So this car, as you could see here, it sits very low inside the engine bay. Well, this car is all about the drive, and so is this channel. So what is this car like to drive? Well, I came out of a 911, a 996. And so they weren't too far off in terms of the year of the car and in terms of technology. I do miss the rear wheel drive of the 911. The way a 911 changes direction is pretty amazing. I like the sound of the engine behind my head. However, this car arguably sounds better. Some people like the sound of a screaming V8. Some people prefer the sound of a flat six. I certainly like both, but I do like the way that this car sounds. In fact, I think this is probably one of the best sounding cars ever made, at least with a V8 engine. In terms of the way that the car changes direction, no, it doesn't change direction as well as a 911, but it does very well. And at the limit, it's very, very neutral. This car is very neutral. So it's very hard to get this car out of shape, despite the short wheelbase. And I tend to like cars with short wheelbases. In fact, the wheelbase in this car is a half-inch shorter than the 997. In terms of power, The power of this car is actually not that much more powerful than, even though it has 380 horsepower, the 911 only had 300, but this car is heavier. It's a heavier car, and you can feel it. I don't feel like it's a heavy car, but it's definitely heavier than the 911. It has a very big V8 out front, so it's gonna weigh a lot, even though the whole car is aluminum. It also has an interior that is filled with leather, and leather is not light. It's not a light material, so that kind of adds a little bit to the heft as well. But in terms of the communicative steering, the steering is as good as the 911. It's a little bit heavy, which I like. The shifter's a little bit heavy, which I like. It definitely has heavier steering, heavier shifting. The clutch, I would say, is about the same. I've had some people in my comments, when they talked about their cars that they've owned, say that the clutch is heavy. I don't find the clutch to be very heavy in this car, but I do find all of the inputs to be a bit on the heavy side when compared to a normal car. Certainly when compared to a GT type of car, like the Jaguar. In terms of power, it could use more power, but again, I have the 4.3, which is the least powerful version of this car. The 4.7 is more powerful, and then once you start to get to the N420s, then they get even more powerful. The GT cars, as they were called in the States, it was an N420 in Europe, and certainly, if you got the V12, you would have a lot more power than this car, and those are more than adequate. So certainly there are plenty of versions of this car to choose from if all-out speed is your priority. I'm looking just to make a lot of noise and to go fast, and the speed that I tend to generate is through, I like to think, is through skill, not so much the raw power of the car. So that's kind of my philosophy. I don't need 1,000 horsepower. Plus, it'll just get me in trouble anyway. And so there you have it. There's my brief introduction to the Aston Martin Vantage. This one, of course, is a 4.3 liter. There's a lot of other versions out there. So you had the Pro Drive, which was the first different variation. You had the 4.7. Then you had the N420, which the N stood for Nürburgring, and then finally the GT, which I think the N420 and the GT were the same car, just with a different name in the States versus in Europe. And of course, the biggest change was in the V12 version of this car, which if you got your hands on one, particularly with a manual transmission, I think is going to be worth an absolute fortune someday. But actually, I think all of these cars are really going to be desirable as time goes on, because people talk a lot about analog cars. Well, this is one of the last analog cars. I know that's a cliche, but the bottom line is this car has normally aspirated engine. It has real gauges. It has a 3-pedal manual gearbox, not a flappy paddle that they call manual. It is a 3-pedal manual gearbox, and those are a disappearing thing, even in the world of Aston Martin, unfortunately. As far as the Aston Martin Vantage goes, apparently after next year's model year, that car is going to be discontinued too. So yeah, it's hard to say what the future is going to look like with electrification, whether it's an electrified future or an electrified Armageddon. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see how that turns out. But I think my opinion in the future is that cars like this are going to be more and more desirable. So if you get your hands on one like this or one of its competitors, the 911, definitely hang on to it, because they're just not making cars like this anymore, and it's a shame. So if you like this kind of content, please please subscribe. Let me know your comments, because actually I've been getting such wonderful comments. I'm up to over 200 subscribers, which is like nothing in the world of YouTube, but it's a lot for me. And I've had such great comments from y'all, so I appreciate that. So keep them coming. And I'm going to keep the videos rolling on too. So until next time.